Welcome to everyone. I'm Henry Yu. I teach history at the University of British Columbia. We welcome you back to a two-day national forum on anti-Asian racism. This is uh, the closing, you could say, for the next 2 hours. Over the last 2 days, we have been gathered to talk about anti-Asian racism. We have people from across the country, and so we welcome you back. For those of you who are joined us for the first day, for those who are just joining us for the first time, we welcome you, and I want to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the unceded, ancestral, and traditional territories of Musqueam. We in Vancouver are on the territories of the Coast Salish peoples, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations, and that I ask all of you to think about where you are and whose territories you're on. One of the things that's really come across very strongly over these last 2 days is that even as we talk about, think about, try to think of how to respond to the violence and racism that so many of our families and communities have suffered and faced over the last year, that we do not forget that we are uninvited guests on the territory of Indigenous peoples who have been here for time immemorial, and so that anything that we come forward with as solutions, we hope to the endemic anti-Asian racism and violence that we've had in Canada historically, as well as in really stark and horrific terms in the last year, that it not be done without remembering and understanding that we are on Indigenous territory, and that the solutions cannot ignore or sidestep that ongoing colonial occupation. So this next 45 minutes or so, we have the opportunity to have some summary thoughts about the discussions over the last 2 days. We I have the honor of having Mohammed Hashim, Executive Director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, with me, as well as Jacqueline Louie, who is a Student Director for the Federation of Asian Canadian Lawyers of BC and a law student at UVic. I think it's really appropriate because I think within just the three of us here is reflected something that has been very powerful over the last 2 days, is to see people come from across the country. Canada is a very large place and it's very difficult often to talk across the regions, to talk across these very different communities located in different places, and the very stark local differences in how we live in this country. And so it's been great to have now people come together from across the country. It's been great to see young and old. So lots of folks who have been in the community for decades, working at and to lessening problems, combating problems, just trying to survive often, and yet also younger folks who are students, who are just beginning, but our careers, you could say, and lives committed to making change and making a more just and inclusive society. So we're thankful to all of those who took part in the conversations in this truly national conversation over the last 2 days. I think I'll offer some sort of high-level summaries. There will be a summary report that captures everything that was raised and shared amongst all the people who came together. We're going to make sure that that's something that is really a record of the conversations, but also starting point. Because we asked the people to gather to talk about not just the effects, and impacts that anti-Asian racism has had on communities, from British Columbia all the way across to the prairies, to Ontario, to Quebec. We've heard, we haven't heard from everyone, but we've heard quite a few stories of pain and resilience as well. And so we want to make sure that that is reflected in how we record what happened over the last 2 days. But we've also asked people to talk about what kinds of things need to be done. You know, what are priorities that really have to be dealt with, and who else needs to be at the table, who else needs to be accountable for bringing about these changes. And that table metaphor perhaps is not a bad way of actually thinking about a lot of the things that have been said. I've heard, you know, myself over the last few days, that metaphor of a seat at the table, you know, that in some sectors, in some areas, just needing a seat at the table, that we're not part of that decision making, you know, in many of the fields, whether it be in education or in healthcare or in law or in the justice system, in the courts, in, you know, across the board, we've heard about the need to have a seat at the table, to not have decisions made for us, about us, but to be there, to be able to say, here's from our perspectives what you need to take into account. And yet, a seat at the table isn't enough. What we've also heard, you know, again and again, is that the table is a problem. That just winning a seat at the table, or fighting for a seat at the table, uh, doesn't mean that we belong, and that the table itself was not built, you know, for people like us. And I think in that sense, anti-Asian racism, like other forms of racism, but also tied to the systemic white supremacy that helped build this country, that is the table, that built that table, so that it is an unequal, you know, table. It is an unequal structure, and those structural problems, the table itself, that has come up again and again in various conversations, in the lists of what are the problems that are being faced, that they go beyond the assaults, they go beyond the verbal assault. They go beyond the fear and the insecurity of walking in the street, and the possibility that someone may punch you or spit on you, or yell something at you as you're walking. We know that that fear of violence, of assault, is only one part of the experience of those in Canada who've had to face um, the the racism of the of not just the last year, but it's a part of our life. And so that's something that's come up again and again in the discussions. I think another thing that we've heard, and as we look over the summary notes of the discussions, is that change is going to be slow. This came up in the Angus Reid survey, and it came out that as we asked Canadians about, you know, what they think about anti-Asian racism, there was a clear division. That there was a significant number of people in Canada who don't believe there is a problem with racism, and there's a significant number of people who feel that we don't need to change. There are others, a significant number, who are feeling the impacts and yet not hopeful that changes can be made even in their own lifetime, that this is a generational timetable to make change. That has come up in these 2 days as well, that there's a lot of people who feel pain and feel a lack of hope. And to acknowledge again that, you know, just in the last weeks, uh, to know that the discovery of 215 children who will never return to their families or their communities because of the residential Indian school system, because of a long history of colonial dispossession that Indigenous peoples still endure. That was a stark reminder to some, although this is something we have known for a long time. And the idea that we can ignore it or be shocked or surprised somehow, that is itself a source of pain. And like with anti-Asian racism, like with what happened this week in London, Ontario, if you feel shocked, if you feel surprised that this has happened, then that is part of the problem of racism, of white supremacy in Canada. As an historian, I ask every time there's a spectacular moment of violence, of racial violence, I'm asked, are you surprised? Are you shocked? And I don't feel that shock. And it's not just because of I'm a historian, but because that is the nature of white supremacy in Canada. That's the nature, in some sense, of our racism that's so different than the United States, is that if something happens to you, that you need to, in fact, prove it, that you start in a hole where people may not even believe you, that you've suffered something, that first you have to prove it. And I think that has come up in our discussions over the last 2 days. Why is it that it takes so much to even be able to speak? The idea that we are a model minority, Asian Canadians, somehow, that we are able to overcome and without complaining and we don't speak out. But is it also because there's a perpetual silencing of not listening, of not hearing? And I think in that sense, how uh, how white supremacy, and I use that term very clearly, not racisms, but the kind of structural white supremacy, the table, you know, and earning that seat at the table. But the table itself, how it's been built, and the idea that Canada wasn't racist in the past, that we haven't gotten over it, that in fact those structures are still there. The table is still the same table. And to be invited as a token to the table, or to be invited to sit at the table but still have no say, or to be invited to the table on the condition that you accept that there is no racism, that your belonging is already an indication that everything's all right. And so those things are some of the ways that I think the discussion over the last 2 days have really reflected, you know, a level of pain, a level of fear, a level of frustration, but also a level of optimism and hope. And I think that's what I would say is the most important thing about coming together. I'm going to ask Mohammed Hashim, as the executive director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundations, to share some of his reflections on the last 2 days. Mohammed.
Well, thank you, Henry. First I wanna acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, the Chippewas, the Ojibwe, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit. And we do this work in solidarity with the First Nations who have inhabited this land for millennia before all of us landed on these shores, and who still exist on this land, proud of who they are, despite the genocidal actions taken by this state to erase them. They are strong, and it is our job collectively to work with First Nations, Métis, and the Inuit in solidarity to make right the wrongs of our past. And I want to just begin by saying, thank you for allowing me into the space. A personal thank you to President Ono and you, Henry, for bringing us all together and creating this space for me to personally listen and learn and participate. I want to zoom out a little bit and reflect on some of the themes I've heard throughout this gathering, and even what you just said right here around fear. It reminds me, like in September last year, 2 Asian Canadians were struck by a car in Brossard, Quebec. Their names were Gerard Chung Sun Yun, and he was 50 years old, and 52-year-old Hoi Ping Ding. The police didn't call it a hate-motivated crime, and they still don't. But the man hit one person, went down a few other streets, hit another person, and they were both Asian. You would think that in a hit or run, they would hit somebody and then run, not find somebody else. And I can't say whether it was or it was not a hate crime, but I can tell you that the community there felt like it was. And I know that feeling of fear that settles in when one hears such news. In January 2017, I got the worst call I can ever imagine. And a friend of mine who worked for the National Council of Canadian Muslims called me the night of the Quebec City massacre. And she told me to get to Quebec City right away to assist the community on the ground. So I flew out early next morning, and I spent that morning in front of the mosque talking to the mosque administration and the victims, mostly like their wives, their sisters, and kids who were there to collect, their cars and belongings for the 6 men that were killed and the 17 that were injured. And after a while, around 2 o'clock, I walked across the street into like a nice pizzeria to grab a quick bite to eat. And I got talking to the owner, and he told me that the last night, while the shooting was happening, the men from the mosque ran into the pizzeria for safety to get away from the shooter. He quickly opened up the door and he hid them. And after the police arrived, they too came inside the pizzeria, and he stayed open almost the entire night. Um, he didn't know what to do, so he did what he could. He just gave them, pizza and drinks. And I asked him that day, how did he feel? And he said he was shocked and confused. He said he was confused because he saw the men running into the pizzeria without shoes. So they ran down a hill across the street filled with snow and ice, barefooted, into his store. This Monday, when I got the news of what happened in London, Ontario, I couldn't get that image out of my mind. Men praying in a space of worship, running for their lives, for safety, barefoot across snow and ice. I honestly felt like doing the same. When I heard, someone ran over 5 Muslims, leaving 4 dead and a 9-year-old in critical condition, I too felt the need for safety. And I know many of my Asian friends felt the same after Atlanta. I know many of them still feel the same today. Through the crackling voices, I heard that same need for safety from so many of the presenters these last 2 days. I heard Amy Go from the CCN-CSJ speak about her fears that anti-Asian racism will be treated like the flavor of the day. And Amy, I promise you, I will do whatever I can to make sure that that doesn't happen. It's too big an issue. We simply can't, because the pain of this moment is honestly it's too great. Our feeling of belonging has been shattered, and we cannot rest until we know that your sense of safety and belonging has been restored. For some, this moment has shattered that assumption that you were included, that you had made it. And to others, it brought back to life the pains of the past. And to some who grew up here, they just didn't assume that this would apply to them. And they're waking up to that too. My organization, the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, was created because of such pain. The government in World War II inflicted a tremendous amount of pain on the Japanese Canadians. The state ripped them of all their assets and put them into internment camps in the most horrible of conditions, simply because of the color of their skin. Many of them have been here, many had been there for generations. And our organization was created out of the Japanese Redress Agreement. When the government of the day in the 1980s, apologized to the Japanese community, our organization was funded. It was completely funded through an investment, an equal investment by the government and the Japanese community to fight racism and to stand in solidarity with the oppressed and to fight for justice for those who have been wronged. And I wouldn't be here if it were not for the pain, but also the commitment of the Japanese community to fight racism. And our job at the CRRF is to bring people together. There's a question that Lara Hunrada had asked, which I thought was incredibly important. She asked if this was a moment when we are coming together to create a new political identity under the banner of Asian Canadians. And what I thought she was really asking was whether there can be, what's the basis of unity upon which all of us are coming and collectively pushing? Is that basis of unity an equation of equality? Is it to create common demands? And how would we create that? And I don't honestly know if I heard the answer, because it's a complex answer, but I did hear there was right across the board, a desire to work together. I know there is such a diversity of opinions, but I know this forum has given energy to many people who felt they were doing this work alone. I recall Carolyn Doy, I believe her name was, who spoke about the fact that it was shocking and yet so endearing when she saw Asian Canadians of all stripes coming together for a vigil in Saskatchewan. It was not something that she experiences regularly, but in her voice, she conveyed she felt stronger because she was with her people. I think the desire to work together and to come together is an important one. In the last federal budget, the Government of Canada tasked my organization to create a national coalition. And I'm a union organizer. I've been doing that for 20 years. I've spent decades building and participating in coalitions. Coalitions are created for one purpose, in my mind at least. That is to build cross-sectoral support for a set of demands, a collective demand. Frederick Douglass says, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. So I question, how can a crown corporation, a branch of government, bring together a coalition? And do we really want a crown corporation deciding what demands communities want? I don't know. But I also recognize there are many coalitions already in existence. Will a national coalition undermine some of the work that community groups are already doing? I don't want to do that. My question is, how can we at the CRRF empower these coalitions already in existence, bring people together, create opportunities for collaboration, and bring like-minded community groups who want to share resources, steal best practices from each other, or simply find their people. We want to work with those who are working on the ground directly, because you're the ones who Canada needs to understand the pain Asian Canadians are facing today. I draw incredible amount of inspiration from the many youth and brave voices who are so pissed off and speaking out loudly to help us understand the pain the communities are feeling, whether it's talking about the microaggressions or even reclaiming their names. Those inspiring young voices are speaking out, and they're loud. And I want those inspiring young voices to hear me say this. Your voices are what will change this country. Every community has gatekeepers. They're the ones closest to power. Sometimes older folks like myself forget that our job, sometimes as gatekeepers, is not to control who goes in and out, but our actual job is to make sure that the next generation, all of you, has the door wide open. For many who are on the ground, I also felt there was a lot of trauma. And the people who are working on the ground can get burnt out. They're under-resourced and feeling unsupported. I personally know that feeling too well. For years, whether it was creating coalitions or organizing communities or walking through a mosque with bloody carpets and bullet holes, and all of it I did off the side of my desk. It's hard because you have to carry the burden to organize. But you also have to be normal in your daily lives, or at least you can try to be. I want to say that when you walk through, it's an important thing that I've noticed that when you walk through fire, you never come out the same. So the experience you're going through today will define who you are. It will make you stronger, and it will make Canada stronger, because you're not going to forget what you've done today in this fight. You'll learn how to fight, and sometimes you'll win and sometimes you'll lose, but you'll hone your skills, and the fight will be a part of you, and that you will carry throughout your lives. So if you need any mentorship, reach out to me personally. Nothing gives me more energy than to see people younger than me doing much better and more amazing things that I could never dream of doing. Henry said it yesterday, this is a long fight. It could take a generation. He said it today too. So fight and fight hard, but don't burn out. We need you for the long haul. I can't promise you will get paid for the hard work you have to do, but I will do everything in my power to walk this journey with you. This much I promise. At the CRRF, we're a small organization. We currently have 6 staff across this country. There's more people that work at my pharmacy than at a national organization to address racism across Canada, currently at least. Many of you have heard that the federal government gave our organization $11 million over the next 2 years to build up our organization and to assist those fighting the rise of racism because of COVID. And I want to remind you that we're a crown corporation, so we move slower than communities because we have a lot of T's to cross and a lot of I's to dot. And this fall, we are planning on launching what will be something of a coalition or a network of coalitions. We're still figuring out that piece, as well as small grants that will help you organize. I ask for your patience because alongside this, we are also building up a national infrastructure for our staff to support your organizing work from coast to coast. So we're actually hiring quite a few people. So if you want to join us, please look out for those positions. I'm joined here today with Rosalind Kang, who is our first Western organizer in the organization's history. We've never had a staff person in the West ever before. And we're building up our team to build up that process. And I also want to remind you that we are not the government. We will stand shoulder to shoulder with you to demand long-term, sustainable organizational funding from governments across Canada, provincial and federally, so that your fights aren't just based on small grants, but that communities have the sustainable resources to address racism adequately in longer periods in their own neighborhoods. And I also I think that's a really important thing because I've heard this ask again and again. We need those resources. I agree. The CRRF will have some small grants available, but we won't be able to give those long-term, large investments that communities need in the neighborhoods to do the work that they need to do in the neighborhoods that they live in. I also want to reflect on a few policy initiatives I think that are really important. We know there are glass ceilings. We know there are bamboo ceilings, and that good qualified people are being kept away from entering into the workforce and rising through it. We agree that employment equity legislation needs to be reformed desperately, and that the regime created needs to be adopted by provinces as well. We're with you on that fight. I also heard that the judicial system needs reform and better representation through judicial appointments and more. We are with you on that fight. I heard about better immigration supports needed and community benefits agreements. I couldn't agree more, and there's so much more that we agree on. And we want to work with you to join on these fights. I also know too well that this is not just your fight. This is our fight. Whether you're brown, black, white, indigenous to this land, we must include an intersectional lens and include everyone of different sexual orientations, gender, identity, class, race, religion, language proficiency, disability, income level, and status. We must come together to address anti-Asian racism. But more than anything, I want to say this. I honestly don't think Canada understands the pain Asian Canadians are going through right now. It is a heavy burden that always falls upon communities to explain. It's not fair, it's not right, but it is a reality we have to tackle because no one can express your pain like you can. Without your voices, this country simply won't understand. So be loud, be proud, and be brave because you are the future, and your full belonging will never be given without a demand. That is the work that's ahead of us. And throughout your fight, you will find me side by side, either at a picket line or in a rally or at the table, with you demanding in every place to end anti-Asian racism together. Thank you for this opportunity to learn and listen, and thank you to the UBC family for putting this together.
Thank you, Mohammed. There were a lot of voices across age spectrum, and we heard again and again that the intergenerational kind of passage that Mohammed has addressed of some people who've been in a fight for a long time, but some people who've just kind of perhaps starting. And I want to kind of pass it over to Jacqueline for her sort of just reactions over these last 2 days. She's been taking part in a lot of the discussions we have many students involved. Again, we are a university, and so we've had the great luxury and benefit and privilege of having students involved in these discussions. So Jacqueline.
Thank you, Henry. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very honored to be invited and to have participated yesterday in the Justice Issues panel. I also want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you virtually from the unceded ancestral and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and the importance of doing that land acknowledgement, but also the importance, especially in the field of law, of recognizing Indigenous peoples and First Nations rights to self-governance, to self-determination, and the validity in upholding their own laws and legal traditions. That was something that we discussed at our issue panel yesterday. Some other things that I've heard reflected on over the past 2 days are, like you mentioned, the need for representation, but also that representation can't be for representation's sake. That a seat at the table is not very powerful depending on what you bring to it. Justice Ahmed spoke at FACL BC's gala last year about representation, being a judge on the federal court. And to paraphrase him, he said essentially that having more Asian judges will not solve racism. In fact, in many cases, it will not even necessarily change the decisions that are being handed down by any court. It matters who is on the bench and what ideas they bring to it. And that applies to any sector beyond justice, any forum that any of us belong to. I think this is really important to reflect on, as we make demands, as Mohammed said, and to be clear, we need to make demands for change to happen. But I think we also need to reflect internally about what demands we're making of ourselves and ask, what are we asking of ourselves? What ladders are we looking to climb? When we ask for representation, are we asking for acceptance or eventual acceptance in this country that we've all acknowledged by now is built on settler colonialism and white supremacy that continues to this day? And I think we need to think individually and collectively about the actions that we take going forward, the next steps that we take, and how that fits in. We need to be actively thinking about the systems that we're participating in and our relations to them. And again, that applies to any sector and to us as individuals in our careers and our pursuits. So I think it's important, there's been so much discussion about the necessity of intersectionality, about anti-racism and anti-oppression. And that's really important, especially as you highlighted, the table itself is a structural issue. I've heard lots of concerns about funding, the need for accessible and stable funding, especially for community organizations, not just for institutions, but for people who are doing the work on the ground. For example, at our justice issues table, we talked about policing and criminal prosecutions and alternatives to those. For example, restorative justice that doesn't get nearly enough funding compared to policing and criminal prosecutions. We need to change that. That needs to be a demand going forward. And absolutely, these things will take time. Both of you have noted that institutional change is difficult and slow. But I also want to push back a little bit on that, if I can, and say that change is about priorities. And we've seen in COVID that priorities can change very quickly and action can happen very quickly if our priorities are in the right place. And if people in power who are making decisions feel pushed enough to make those decisions. And so I think we need to look within ourselves and within our communities to recognize the own power that we have to push decision makers to be the decision makers who have an intersectional lens so that this change isn't as slow as we think it might be. I think it can go actually a lot faster, and there's a lot more hope than we might have in this moment when we're all experiencing a lot of pain. I don't know if you have thoughts to add to that, Henry.
Thanks, Jacqueline. No, I actually was just I was actually taken aback for a second at how that's why it's been so powerful for me for the last maybe Mohammed and I have been around too long, because you're absolutely right, Jacqueline. You reminded us, reminded all of us that I've seen that too in the last year, that even as we've been suffering these kinds of impacts, that we've seen priorities change rapidly. Funding priorities change rapidly. And so you're absolutely right. And again, I am so grateful that in coming together, over these conversations. That's been actually the biggest, in some sense, I think, takeaway, is that this national forum is about all these people coming together, many of whom have never met before. And many of the older, I'd say, activists and organizers, I think they just the feeling that I just had, and maybe Mohammed just had, where when you said, no, we're not waiting. Why should we wait? This can happen faster, and you're absolutely right. And we all need to be held accountable. Those of us who perhaps have been around and lost a little bit of hope, lost a little bit of that kind of optimism that things can change fast. And you're holding us to account, and we should be held to account. So thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you to all of those students. And, I hesitate to use the term young or youth. It's like people who actually perhaps have not been, had a little bit of that hope pounded out of them through banging their head against the table, thinking that this table's solid and won't change. And maybe our toolkits, if there's another thing to take out of, I think, the discussions, especially when in this last day, as we had working tables talking about solutions and next steps, and that the toolkits are the problem too, that we need
Henry, I want
toolkits.
to jump in because I think that, if you don't mind, like I was so inspired by what you were saying. That was incredible. I think what you were saying was that, our generation kind of fought to be at the table, and what did that get us? And that the new table that needs to be created is not another seat at the same old table, but a different table altogether. And wow, I am with you. How do we get out of the way and just create space for you to run? I think that's the job that we need to think about with honesty and sincerity, because there's so many gatekeepers in my own community. I know that they're just there, and sometimes we ask for permission. You ask for permission, but I want to tell you, please don't ask for permission. Just do it. This is like, the future really is yours, and it's not going to happen with somebody else's permission. It's going to happen because we're looking at it from the same table. You're looking to create a new table.
Thanks. And I think what better way to kind of draw this session closed than to say that thank you, Jacqueline. Thanks, Mohammed. But again, I'm so hopeful. Again, I have the privilege again of teaching at a university where we encounter 18 to 20 something year olds every year. But and I maybe we all can benefit from thinking about how we can get out of the way and empower those whose future it is. My children, and it's the country is for you, and so we should make sure that inheritance is one that's worthy and worth the future generations to come. So thank you again, and I just want to say thank you again on behalf of the people who put a lot of time and effort into planning this. As we go into this final section of the 2 days, I just want to again a big thank you to the planning committee, to the staff who spent a lot of their time and energy and their devotion and passion over the last 2 months to help make this national forum and this conversation possible, to bring, again, in the midst of COVID, to be able to do this virtually has been amazing. It's been like a hotel where people have been going from room to room, but it's all virtual. And to build that hotel, that the staff and all those who put this together, our thanks, all of us who were able to spend the last 2 days meeting and talking within that set of rooms. Thank you again. We're so grateful. I'll draw this to the close, and there'll be a bit of a delay and a break, and then the last section, our session, will start. So thank you again, all of you, for joining us, and thank you again to Mohammed and to Jacqueline for your comments and your sharing of how you found the last 2 days.
We have never been allowed people. Our elders always taught us that actions speak louder than words, so we learn to keep our heads down, keep our grades up, keep our kin close, keep our mouths shut. I wonder what it does to a people when they stay quiet for so long. Do they forget their voice? The sound of their stories, the resilience of language? When you are no longer in your motherland, does your mother tongue still sing of home? What work songs lifted our spirits as we built the railroad? What prayers did we whisper as they sent us to camps in the mountains to meditate on all the ways we don't belong to this country? So we stayed quiet. As they burned our Chinatowns down and spit on our grandmas at bus stops, we stayed quiet. As they laughed in our faces and told us to go back where we came from, but they've mistaken our silence for compliance. Looked on our meekness as weakness. See, we, and not the submissive stereotype that's been depicted on silence, on us, they've gotten it twisted. See, silence is golden, as are we. A gradient of yellow to brown, every Koreatown a little Saigon, an act of defiance. Every hunchback elder a humble giant. Silence is grace in the triumph, is peace in the riot. Silence is bold, a force. It is the brewing calm before the coming storm, and now the sky is splitting open and the rage is pouring forth, so this is for every kid who has ever tried to pull their nose bridge to make it taller. Every time they mocked us because our eyes are smaller. This is for our elders, both alive and remembered, for their lessons, the tough and the tender. For our full names, past and present, may they be pronounced, may they be respected. For every chink in the national fabric, every nip in the winter wind of prairie towns and northern hamlets coast to coast on stolen land. We are here. We've been here. From takeout joints and internment camps to internships and graduation caps, we are strong. We have pride. We fight. We fall. We rise. And to the ones who say we don't belong, it's them who should open their eyes.